I love skiing. I've always been a skier. Skiing is always how I've experienced the land. And that's something that I'm trying to help bring to my people, because when you go to Eagle Crest right now, there are a few Native people out there, but it's really majority white folks out on the mountains. And so, like, for me, that means helping to create these programs to get my people back in these places.
Welcome to Season 13, Episode 2 of the Backcountry podcast. I'm Adam Howard. Tlingit skier Ellen Bradley is an advocate, scientist, athlete, and storyteller. Fierce and thoughtful, she defies the narrative that wild Alaska is there only to be conquered by heli operations and other extractive industries. She loves to slide on snow and wants more Indigenous people to share in her joy. Born and raised in the Seattle area, Bradley started skiing Stevens Pass at age 4. For her, skiing has always been a source of connection to both the land and her ancestors, especially because she grew up far away from her traditional homelands in southeast Alaska. Today, she's working with tribal organizations and the greater ski community to make the sport more accessible for Native kids. That resulted in a partnership between Ikon Pass and Natives Outdoors for the 23-24 season, in which 30 scholarships have been awarded to Indigenous people who receive passes, rentals, and lessons. In this episode, Bradley speaks about how her background in science and passion for skiing complement one another. She reflects on the challenges of growing up away from her Alaska homeland and why we should let Indigenous people tell their own stories. We'd like to thank Arva for supporting this episode and independent media. For 35 years, Arva has been at the forefront of designing and developing snow safety equipment. But now their commitment to safety goes a step further with a campaign that touches the hearts of adventurers and their loved ones alike. Inspired by the relationship between Arva athlete and two-time freeride world tour champion Aurélien Ducrot and his mother, Safer for You, Better for Mom reflects Arva's deep understanding of the dual nature of mountain passion, the irresistible draw for explorers, and the legitimate concern families have for the safety of their loved ones. Arva's message urges us to listen to our inner voice of caution, that little voice that guides us toward prudence. It's the voice of our loved ones, which even in the silence of snow-covered mountains reminds us of the importance of safety and sound decision-making. By choosing Arva, you honor the call of the mountains while weaving in an invisible yet resilient thread that connects you, the adventurer, to those who eagerly await your return. Safer for You, Better for Mom embodies this dual commitment, the promise of exploration and the peaceful return to your loved ones. Learn more at arva-equipment.com or check out #SaferForYou. All right, friends, let's get into it. We hope you enjoy this new episode. Ellen Bradley, welcome to the Backcountry podcast.
Thanks for having me, Howie.
So I was thinking, as I was preparing for this interview, I wrote down a quote, and I'm just going to read it back to you. It's from one of several stories online, one of which we published on backcountrymagazine.com, written by Annika Williams. Backcountry skiing is like scientific field work, you say. You're an observationist. You listen to a place and you let it speak to you. And I was like out on a mountain bike ride, whipping through the forest, thinking like, it's so much harder to observe at pace on a bike in the woods than it is when you're ski touring, when you're walking. What are your thoughts on the approach? Obviously, when you're descending, you're cruising, it's a different experience, but it's the walk up where you're going through the trees, you study and so on. How does that work for you as a scientist and as a skier?
Yeah. So for me, like backcountry skiing, so much of the slow and intentional nature of how we approach the mountains just reminds me of like almost any given day that I've had doing fieldwork as a scientist. I spent a summer doing fieldwork out in the Hoh Rainforest on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington, and we were studying mosses on trees and tree climbing. And so we were spending every single day in the same tree or in the same grove of big leaf maples, climbing the trees, spending time with those mosses. And you just really get to know a place when you spend a lot more intentional and slow time in those places. And I feel like I get that same feeling when I'm approaching a backcountry tour and walking, especially when I'm doing it in the same places, on the same tours, either in a place that I'm living or visiting. Like you really get to know a place differently than when you're, as you said, descending and moving in a much faster pace. You're not noticing each of the individual trees in the same way that you are when you're moving uphill, making your observations, making your decisions about avalanche safety. It's such a parallel between these two worlds that I walk as a scientist and as a skier. And it's this really cool way that I feel like sometimes, like as a skier, I become a scientist in those spaces, or as a scientist, like I can think like a skier. And I find that that like helps me in both of my realms and disciplines to be like a better observationalist.
Interesting. Several years ago, I interviewed a woman from Jackson, Wyoming, Nancy Bacchino, and she is a scientist as well and studies trees. She's like the speaker of the trees. And she talked about how she gets to know less with her work, but more in just her ski touring. Like she'll get to know certain trees and kind of do these similar routes and check them out when she's going along. Do you have any kind of places like that where you have a relationship with certain trees? And could you tell us a little about that?
The place that I definitely have the strongest relationship to trees is on my traditional homelands. So I'm Tlingit, which is a tribe of Southeast Alaska. My people are from everywhere from Yakutat in the north down to Ketchikan in the south. And for the last 2 winters, I've got to spend some time skiing on my traditional homelands in Juneau and Ikon on Ikon land. The ski area outside of Juneau on Douglas Island is called the Eagle Crest, and it's in this perfect location to have some really incredible terrain inbounds, but then also incredible backcountry access. And I have some really specific routes that I love to take just coming out of the Eagle Crest parking lot, heading up different mountains around the ski area. And there are some trees in there that I have some really strong connections with. A lot of them are mountain hemlocks. There's some spruce up in there. And they are just like the most woolly looking trees in the world. The Eagle Crest is in a rainforest in the Tongass rainforest. So these trees are absolutely coated in mosses and lichens and liverworts. And even in the winter, some of those mosses hold really strong. They hold this different weight that I think trees in any other place in the world do. Like you can really feel your interactions with them. You can feel the breath that it is giving you and the carbon dioxide that you are giving back to the trees, because the moss is this blanket that holds so much mass around you as you're walking through those trees that I can think of like a handful of trees that I know personally and individually and could probably draw if I was a better artist, but I'm really terrible at drawing.
Tell us about your specific field of study. I mean, you work on, as I understand it, mosses.
I've actually worked in a ton of different disciplines as a scientist throughout my career, and one of them was working on epiphytes. So epiphytes would be the category that includes like mosses, liverworts, and lichens, things that are growing on trees but don't have a parasitic relationship to the tree. So they're not actually taking away from the tree. They're actually working in a more mutualistic relationship. And that was kind of part of what we were studying, was looking at how those relationships between those two different kinds of species, like a tree being this obviously large entity in a forest, and these mosses seemingly small and often overlooked, actually playing this really large role in photosynthesis and like the carbon capture that exists in these spaces. But that was definitely one of my favorite research projects that I've worked on. And so that's why I end up talking about it a lot, although it's been, I think the last year I worked on it was 3 years ago. So it's been a while since I've spent time with those mosses and trees. But it was just this wonderful experience of getting to climb trees with ropes and harnesses, which if you've never gotten to have that experience, I highly suggest it, because it really allows you to slow down and build these relationships with these places. And it also allowed me to take a few really important naps in my life of just like sleeping on a tree branch 20 meters up from the forest floor that were like some really introspective moments for me.
That's fascinating. I don't know that I've ever taken a nap in a tree. Napping in the woods or in the backcountry is like one of my favorite things in the world to do, whether I'm hunting or ski touring. I don't know why it seems so special, but it is.
Yeah, I agree. I love taking a nap. Like anytime I'm doing field work in between sample taking, that there's just something so special about laying outside and sleeping. It feels foreign, even though it's the most natural thing for us to do.
You said you hadn't worked on this particular type of science in the last several years, but what are you doing today?
Yeah, so I'm actually kind of taking a little bit of a sabbatical from science at the moment. I have been working on a film project for the last couple of years, and it's really taken up almost 100% of my time and attention. I actually quit my job as a scientist back in December. So I've been not a scientist in an official capacity for 10 months, but I don't think having an official work position as a scientist is what ultimately makes you a scientist. I think going out into the world and making observations and creating your own conclusions from those is what makes you a scientist, which is like something I'm having to constantly remind myself of, that just because I'm not currently an employed in scientist does not take away like that aspect of my identity and the way I see the world. But before I quit my job, I was working for Woodwell Climate Research Center in their Arctic department, looking at permafrost thaw in the Arctic. And then my project specifically was looking at how tundra fires, which we're seeing an increase in the intensity and frequency of tundra fires up in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta of Alaska, how they're affecting phytoplankton populations at tundra lakes. And we're using phytoplankton kind of as a proxy of environmental health, how photosynthesis was occurring and like at what level, in order to better understand how that would affect the entire food web, which would have implications on like fish, which are super important to native communities of the YK Delta.
Can you tell us at all about your film project?
Yeah, so my film project started out as my first trip home to ski on my traditional homelands. So I grew up in the Salish Sea area in the Seattle area and grew up skiing at Stevens Pass. Skiing to me was always my connection point to the land and the places that I was living with my dad and my brother, of just like really getting to spend that intentional time in places with the land, with ancestors, with relatives. And I never really got that growing up on my own homelands and the place where my people come from. And so I'd spent a lot of time in Southeast Alaska growing up, but it was always in the summer, which was obviously a very beautiful place to spend summers. But for me, skiing was that connection point. And so I finally got to do my first trip home to ski back in January of 2021. And we told a little story about that for a Cleanest Line blog for Patagonia. And that trip kind of just spurred this film project of wanting to tell more of that story and my motivations for wanting to do that, both from a like skiing being my connection point and wanting to have that connection to my land, and then also more of an analysis of the narratives that we are told in the outdoor industry about what Alaska is and what that means for outdoor recreationalists, especially skiers, and how those narratives are really false narratives and also are participating in this constant erasure narrative of Indigenous peoples.
Can I interrupt you really quick? I'm sorry, but what are those narratives? I can only imagine. I just want to make sure that I'm going to see it the same way or understand it.
So, you know, when a lot of people think of Alaska, one of the first things they'll think of is the last frontier, right? And I read this incredible book a couple of years back that's called Red Nation Rising. And while there are a lot of definitions you can find for like what the mere frontier means, like the way that the Red Nation identifies the word frontier is like this last meeting place between civilization and savagery and like lack of civilization. And so looking at the like what the implications are of calling Alaska the last frontier from that lens of that definition of the word frontier just kind of emphasizes this Alaska as this place where colonization is not complete or like continuously happening. And while that is true across the United States, like colonization is active. It is not something that happened in the past. It is still happening to my people. That can't be how we identify Alaska to this day. Our people are still so present. There's like over 240 plus federally recognized tribes in Alaska alone, of the 570 plus federally recognized tribes in the entire United States. That's almost 50% of all federally recognized tribes exist exclusively in the so-called state of Alaska. And if the narratives that we are being told are like, this is the place that is the last frontier, it is this untouched by man place, it's this place for anyone, but especially outdoor recreationalists, to come and conquer or explore and be the first people to do descents or climbs or whatever it is, it completely ignores this extensively long history of peoples and a really diverse set of peoples who have lived in these places for tens and tens of thousands of years, and really just centers that narrative on this non-Indigenous perspective of this place. And for me, that contributes to that erasure narrative of not acknowledging the history of Alaska prior to contact, not acknowledging that history of colonization, past and present in Alaska, and really then never fully showing Alaska for what it truly is. And that is a place where these people have lived forever, since time immemorial. If you do all of that, then you miss the beauty and the full circle of like what these stories that we could be telling about Alaska really are. The vast majority of that story is just missing, and we're only seeing the perspective of your heli skiers or your Bradford Washburns or your John Muirs.
Wow. I mean, my mind is just spinning right now thinking about how, as someone in the media, we focus on those objective positions, right? You're going here to do this, hopping over to get, from the airport to the Chugach or whatever. Mm-hmm. It's so easy to just think objective, and not just objective, but just your own personal kind of selfish desires in the mountains. So with that in mind, how should we be thinking about that? I mean, I'm not guessing you're saying we shouldn't be doing these sports that we both enjoy, but how can we, as non-natives, kind of engage in this place and have this conversation?
So that's part of what I want to explore in this film. And as a bit of a sneak peek, one of the solutions that I identify to like retelling this narrative is putting Indigenous peoples back into the places we belong. And so for me, right, as you said, like I love skiing. I've always been a skier. Skiing is always how I've experienced the land. And that's something that I'm trying to help bring to my people, because when you go to Eagle Crest right now, there are a few Native people out there, but it's really majority white folks out on the mountains. And so like for me, that means helping to create these programs to get my people back in these places. And I say back in these places because while skiing or snowboarding or whatever it is, outdoor rec has become this like white space, this white activity, they all have their origins in Indigenous peoples and Indigenous ways of moving to the land. Like we see skiing actually came out of like Mongolia, out of Indigenous peoples moving through landscapes. And there's even some evidence to suggest there was some skiing that came out of South Central Alaska. I've seen some artifacts of skis that had like seal skins as the original skins of how we would move through landscapes. And that's even how they got their name to today. And so for me, it's like returning skiing to its origins as this Indigenous way of knowing, this traditional ecological knowledge on how to move through landscapes, how to navigate avalanche terrain, how to move to different communities. And so for me, that means right now getting the youth out on the mountains. And so I've been helping to work on different youth programs with Douglas Indian Association, which is a Native tribe in the Juneau area. They have a program that helps middle and high school kids get out on the mountains. I started a program with Tlingit and Haida, which is the larger tribal entity for all of Southeast Alaska. And then we also had a program with Sealaska Heritage Institute that was an internship for a Native student in high school who was hosted by the Coastal Alaska Avalanche Center. And so we were teaching her avalanche safety and then a lot of like snow signs. And she's just this absolutely badass Alaska Native woman who's going to go on and be this incredible scientist, and had never had that avalanche safety education. So hadn't been able to go out in the backcountry. And now that she does, like, it's going to be so incredible to see how that changes her life. So one of the solutions then for me, based on all that, is for non-Indigenous people, when you are visiting places that you are not native to, it is one, figuring out who is from there, who has always been from there and who still exists there. And then figuring out how you can be an ally in those spaces, whether that's like, in these cases, contributing to these programs financially or with gear, or maybe with volunteering your time to come out and ski with the kids. Or maybe it's other things going on, like in other communities, like in Yakutat, we're dealing with logging right now. And it has been a huge division within the community in Yakutat. And it is, if I'm correct, I think the only place where logging is actively happening in the Tongass, which has been such an issue for our people for so long. And so I think it's like identifying what are some of the things that the people of these places are currently facing, and then what are some of the ways that we can help reconnect those people to these lands. And so just for me and my focus, that's skiing, but I think that can be so much more broader than just skiing in so many different ways. And then I think on top of all that, like, it's being a more responsible visitor or guest, especially when you're traveling to a new place that you don't live. For me personally, I don't heli ski. I don't want to heli ski because I don't think that that is a really healthy way to have a relationship with the land. And I think it goes back to like the conversation on how I see backcountry skiing as being more of like this scientific activity. Like when you really slow down with the land, you're able to observe it. You're able to develop relationships with trees, with different slopes. And I think ultimately by you helping to develop that relationship for yourself with those places, that place is also learning about you and knowing who you are. And when you have that reciprocal relationship with the land, I think you're a lot less likely to get in an avalanche because you are able to listen to that land better, and that land knows you and knows what your intentions are of being in these places, of why you were going there. And I think when you have those good intentions, when you have those relationships, all parties are able to be better in those spaces to better understand each other. And I think you're a lot less likely to experience avalanches or to have weird things happen to you in the backcountry because you're just way more aware than if you fly to Alaska, skip over the native communities, get on your helicopter and are dropped off on the mountain. First thing, you don't have any relationship along that way to ground you in the place and to make you a better observationist in determining whether or not you should be skiing that slope in the first place.
Right. And then you have a guide doing all your thinking for you as well.
Exactly. And like really that's nice when it's like, oh, like obviously the safety concerns around avalanche and backcountry skiing can be a lot to take in, especially in a new environment. And I get having a guide, but at the same time, like if that guide isn't native, then they also probably don't have that relationship to that land that is going to protect you in those same ways. I have a few friends who've become guides that are Indigenous, and it is so incredible to be able to see their perception versus maybe their colleagues on some of the places they're guiding. And I think like that's another solution to this. That's like another future of how we be better guests in these places is we have more guide services that are actually Indigenous peoples to the land you're on, so that visitors can also have a better experience when visiting because they're going to be able to have more connection points to the history of these places if the people who are guiding them have lived there their whole life, have family who have lived there their whole life.
Let's talk a bit more about your life. You know, you said you grew up down in the Seattle area and you skied with your family there. I'd like to know how your dad got into the sport. Like, how did he interface with that? What's his story a little bit?
Both my dad and my mom got into skiing in their 20s. My dad grew up in Seattle his whole life in like the Ballard area, went to University of Washington. And I think just like in his 20s, he was just drawn to the mountains like a ton of people are in Washington. When you can see the Cascades, it's hard to not want to go be a part of them. And yeah, like I think it was something they both got into when they were adults, not when they were kids. And I think they both like really immediately fell in love with that way to connect with the lands that they were living on. And when they had my brother and I, it was just a priority for them that was something they put us both into. And so we were really fortunate to get into skiing at really young ages. Like I think I was 4 when I started skiing, and it just kind of became this like family activity we did as much as possible on as many weekends of the year as we could, balancing the other sports that my brother and I played. I'm so grateful to them that like that's what they decided that we were going to do as a family activity, because it really changed my life. Because without that, I don't think I would have become a scientist either, without having started skiing at such a young age, because I got to spend so much time outside and kind of this unstructured play in a way that's really different than other sports that you play. That really allows you to form those connections and then to like become more aware of your surroundings. That like formed my brain as a scientist from a young age.
Tell me about your southeastern Alaska connection. What's your family's story there?
Yeah, so my grandma and like our family is from Rangoon, which is a really small community out in Ikon, which is now Admiralty Island. And she went to boarding school. She went to the Wrangell Institute in Wrangell and had a ton of kids in Southeast Alaska and kind of followed her younger son as he went down to school to go to college. My dad was the only one of his siblings that wasn't born in Alaska. He was born in Seattle. But for the most part, our family was kind of all over Southeast Alaska. Like she spent a lot of her life in Wrangell and Juneau. Yeah, we have a lot of connections to Juneau. And then my mom's side of the family is actually not Tlingit. They're white and my mom actually went to high school in Ketchikan. And so that's kind of like where our connection point to coming back in the summers was all my mom's best friends still live in Ketchikan to this day. And so in the summers growing up, we would just come and spend a few weeks at a time or a month at a time in Ketchikan, getting out on the land, swimming, fishing, boating. And it was a really, really beautiful way to spend summers. But yeah, it's kind of funny that both my mom and my dad have these connections to Southeast Alaska, even though my mom is in Tlingit. But my mom moved to Ketchikan in high school because my grandpa was working for the Forest Service, and he came up and was working on the Tongass at the time, which is really interesting to talk to him now about his perceptions of what was going on in the 70s and the 80s with the Tongass when it comes to logging, because that was around the time that a lot of communities were going through these we experienced a lot of boom bust cycles with logging, but especially they're experiencing these booms during that time. So there was a lot of logging that was happening. But shortly after that time, a lot of those communities went through this bust. And so, yeah, just kind of weird that they connected. But I think that's also kind of what they connected over my parents, was that they both have this connection to Southeast.
Was it skiing that drew you up there, like ultimately?
Yeah, skiing kind of was ultimately what drew me to live there. I moved up to Juneau last year in December and stuck around until May. I'm actually living in Colorado now. But yeah, it was mostly skiing that kind of brought me back home. Was the first trip that we did in January 2021. I absolutely fell in love with Eagle Crest and Juneau as a place, and got called back again in June of 2021 for Celebration, which is exactly what it sounds like. The Sea-Alaska, the regional corporation for all of Southeast Alaska, throws on a huge celebration every other year. And it was the first one they had thrown since COVID. So my whole family came up for Celebration. And I think that was another moment of like, I love Juneau. I need to be in this place. I need to be in this community. And we really started to plant the seeds for some of these youth programs that we were able to get started last year in the summer when we were there for Celebration with some other incredible Native and non-Native folks in the area who just wanted to get involved. And then working on this film was like the last thing that ultimately was like, all right, we need to be in Juneau. We need to be living in these places. If we're going to tell a Native story around skiing, then we need to tell the Native story in the right way, which to us meant like being there, not just coming whenever there was a good storm, like being there for the whole season and experiencing all of the weather patterns that came along with that. And like a lack of better word, like earning our powder days by skiing in the rain.
How did you find yourself integrating into that community? You talk about it with such reverence. I'm sensing that you called it home, right? How did you find yourself integrating as someone from away? You certainly had connections there. What is the community like, Indigenous and white? How does it all work?
I saw a quote on Instagram recently that was like, the gist of it was essentially, Alaska is this really special place, and especially for Indigenous people, where even if you didn't grow up here, you probably identify it as home. And that was something that really hit me in the heart. And like, I feel like sometimes I've struggled with the fact that I grew up away, but it was a decision my grandma made, and she made the decision for really specific reasons. And I'm very grateful to her for that. But it's home. It's where I belong. It's where my genetics come from. It's where I feel my most comfortable. And I think Juneau really kind of exemplifies that. Juneau is like this really unique place compared to anywhere else I've been in the world. Especially as like, it's not really a ski town, but it's also kind of a ski town at the same time. Growing up in the lower 48, I was really close to the Tulalip Reservation. So I had a really good understanding of like what reservations were like within the lower 48 and kind of what that system looked like. A ton of kids from Tulalip came to my high school. And Alaska is just completely different. Like we only have one reservation in the entire state. That's Metlakatla. It's a Tsimshian reservation closer to Ketchikan. But the rest of the state, we have these regional corporations. The United States government, just like when they came to Alaska and were making decisions about Alaska Native land claims, decided to go a different route. And I think there's a lot of positives to that route and also a lot of negatives. Ultimately, it left us with these like regional corporations and village corporations. And so the way that our land is like delineated as tribal land versus like United States government land is just, it's pretty different than how it is in the lower 48. And I think part of the results from that is that Juneau is one of the most integrated cities that I've ever been to compared to anywhere else in the United States when it comes to Native communities. If you go to Fred Meyer or if you go to Costco in Juneau, you're going to see mostly Native people. And we make so many jokes about that living in Juneau. Like if you needed community or if you were missing your Native presence, like just go to Costco. Like the guy checking you in is probably Native. Like we'd make jokes like he'd probably take your tribal ID if you didn't have your Costco card on you. Like, and then there's also, because of that, so much more of this like resurgence of Indigenous excellence happening in Juneau on so many different mediums, especially when it comes to art. We were just up there a couple weeks ago for this music festival that's called Ak Rock that they had started during COVID and it had only happened virtually. And they were finally able to have it in person a couple weeks ago. And it's this entire Indigenous music festival where they brought artists from all across the world that are all Indigenous groups. It was so incredible to see the turnout by people in Juneau, both by the Indigenous community, people traveling from Anchorage. We traveled from Colorado for it. And then also a ton of non-Indigenous people showing up and supporting this festival. And that just is happening, I feel like, all the time in Juneau. At any given moment, you could probably find a class from either the Alaska Heritage Institute, Tlingit and Haida, or Gold Belt on something, whether it's beading or cedar hat weaving or chilkat or painting or form. Like it's just something is always happening in Juneau around Indigenous revitalization of culture, of language, of art. I don't know, for me, like this really magical place as a person who grew away and didn't have that same connection to culture and tradition on the day to day. Growing up with my aunts, I had my grandma, we had a lot of connections to who we are as a people, but to just be able to like be in Juneau and meet a ton of people of my generation who are active in revitalization of culture in their own medium, in whatever way it is, from language to dance to drums to tattoo, whatever it is. Like it's so cool. And it's awesome to see a place where Indigenous people are retaking up our space. And then I also find that in Juneau, I think maybe it's just because of that, like more of an integration that you see. And I think that integration is new. I don't think that's how Juneau has always been. I think that's especially new within the last 5 years. But seeing that, like, I think you see a lot more non-Indigenous people who are really like understanding and also huge allies of the work that we are all doing. And, living where I do in Colorado, I don't see that at all. And so for me, it feels like this really unique place. I don't know. I think it draws a lot of us to it because it's just this place where things are happening.
Yeah, it's flourishing. And, when we think about in the lower 48, Indigenous peoples in the Native communities, reservations, it's hard not to think about poverty, right? And when I read about your ski program, I'm like, well, there's the biggest barrier to skiing in many ways in any community is a socioeconomic barrier. It's fascinating to hear about Juneau because it sounds like there's so much to learn from a place like that, both white and Native, as to how things can be. I'm guessing there is, because of Alaska's newness as a state and how the government has been dealing with the Native communities up there, that they got some things right that they had historically gotten wrong down here. Yeah. Is there less poverty in Juneau for the Native peoples than there is in Colorado?
I would say that the U.S. government I don't know, they did some things better and they did some things worse in the way that they handled Alaska Native land claims. Yeah, I don't know if I feel comfortable commenting on whether or not there's more or less poverty in Alaska. It's different and it's also the same. And like how the Native peoples have experienced constant colonization. Like I think there's a lot of ways that reservations can be really limiting on like economic growth on like a personal level or for within a family. I can see how that was different for my grandma because she left Alaska and came down to Seattle seeking out like education and more access to that for her kids and how that changed my family's life around. But I don't know. It's different.
Yeah.
it's different. Like, it's really complex, and people have written like really long academic papers on the differences between ANSCA, which is the law that organizes Alaska Native land claims, and then your reservation systems and treaties. You could take like hours and hours discussing that, and it can't really be boiled down other than to say like some things were better for us and some things were worse.
Right.
So NILCA is the law that the United States government passed as kind of a response to their original law, ANSCA. As a part of these like native land claims acts, they had to delineate who had access to subsistence hunting and fishing. And one way that there's a huge difference between Alaska and the lower 48 is in Alaska, anyone who lives in a rural area has rights to subsistence fishing and hunting, not just natives. And that's complex. That's really complex and opens up a ton of discussion for what that means, because in a lot of ways that kind of doesn't give rights to Alaska Natives, or at least not different rights to Alaska Natives that it would give to anyone else living in the area. And then on the other hand, like if you're living in a rural place in Alaska, you need to fish or hunt because you're not going to have a grocery store. And if you did, you're not going to be able to afford things at a grocery store, or you're going to have to travel to a hub to find a grocery store. And so it's really complex, but in a lot of ways, the government didn't delineate differences between the rights of natives and non-natives in Alaska. And then in some ways they did. And it's complex.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I was checking out your Instagram feed, and a lot of your tags of places are native lands or stolen lands. And of course, we've seen that before. It can seem like a very small thing, because I think about this a lot, right? Because we all recreate and live on what was historically native land, right? Those of us who live in North America. And I always am struck by it in certain ways, both of people who do it who are non-native and people who do it who are. And I wonder, kind of from your perspective, what's the thought process there? What is the hope of making that acknowledgement? It's just interesting to me. You know, I haven't had an opportunity to have this conversation with someone like yourself before who makes that simple little acknowledgement. And yet it's so powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. I think for me, the intention is like, it takes 2 seconds to type in a location on Instagram. And so it's like, why wouldn't I use those 2 seconds, minimal effort, as just a reminder to myself even, and to others that like anywhere you are on Turtle Island or North America, you are on native land, you are on stolen land, that even tribes or First Nations who ceded their land didn't intend to lose all access to their land. And so whatever, it was stolen. So for me, I think that's the intention. It's just like a constant everyday reminder to people. I think it's something that Native peoples have faced our entire lives and have a pretty good understanding of. And a lot of non-Native people have never thought of it that way. Right. And I know that that was something that I was never like taught in school or that people talked about in any kind of academic settings. And so I think it's a good reminder to people. It's something to make people maybe stop and question it or think, oh, that's weird. I wouldn't have expected that to come up as a location tag on Instagram. And maybe like that moment of reflection a person will have might spur them to educate themselves more, or maybe just like think a little bit more about what that means for their own life and every single day of every moment that they're on Turtle Island.
So many of us that went through the education system up until probably quite recently, you know, natives were conveniently just left out of the conversation in so many ways. And is society making any gains in, you know, I was struck by the term you used early in the conversation, erasure. And of course, acknowledgement, you know, is another part of that conversation. Are we getting anywhere? Is the needle moving at all?
Yeah. I wonder this a lot. In the work that I do and then watching other people's work in these spaces, I often wonder if like we're just screaming into the void and nothing is changing, or if we are spurring conversations that people wouldn't have ever had or considered. And maybe that's enough at least to get things moving or the change that we needed in order for more and bigger and more important changes to happen. I do think in my experience, I've seen a lot of good on that realm come from social media, of like this connection point between different tribal communities through different communities across the United States and Canada, and being able to have some of these conversations about what we're experiencing in our own home communities and being able to identify that with things happening across the countries. I know for me, like, it's allowed me to connect with a lot of really incredible Indigenous folks doing work in their own mediums and realms that I see making change. And I think some of that change that comes from social media is part of the reason I've spent a lot more time focusing more on the skiing and the talking about skiing on social media than I have my science in the last few years. Is science is this incredibly slow process, right? Like, you make your observations, you do your experiments, you write your papers, and maybe other academics read your papers, but they're usually not having these like widespread community changes. And that doesn't mean that science isn't important or that intentional nature of it being really slow is wrong. But I just really struggled in my science to see how I was making a difference day to day or month to month, week to week, year to year, whatever. Versus when I kind of got connected to the outdoor industry as an Indigenous skier, I started to see how much faster of an impact I could have, even if it wasn't a huge impact. And I've seen that especially in like the scholarships that I'm able to help run and work on. Like, this year, we were able to increase our scholarship with Ikon Pass from 15 scholarships last year to 30 this year. And that feels gigantic to us, to be able to give away 30 full Ikon Passes to Indigenous folks across the United States and Canada. And talking to some of our past recipients about how like just having a pass or having access to gear was able to change their life. Like, the conversation is always coming back to how that is impacting people's mental health, their connection to the land and the places they're living in. It is really changing people's lives. And so many of our past recipients from this scholarship and from others have gone on to create their own programs within their own communities of getting Native youth on the mountains, or starting their own scholarships, or starting a program in something that isn't skiing, but is still incredibly important for getting Native people on the land. And that's been so powerful, I feel like, to be able to see that and to be able to be like, that's happening immediately. I'm just able to step in these spaces. I can ask a few brands for some gear, and all of a sudden I can change an entire family. I can change an entire group of people, an entire Indigenous person's life. And that often just like reverberates out. And so that's kind of like what gives me hope to feel like we are changing the needle and changing the conversation, or making change, or at the very least, we're helping to start some of those changes. But sometimes I definitely question that and get really down on myself that we aren't making bigger changes or some of the more important changes than just like some of the conversations that we're having.
Well, I can tell you that I think you're probably having a bigger change than you know, because it's only been happening for so long. You know, we've been doing here in our community a ski program for all the children in our local elementary school. And we have a ski area in town, Smuggler's Notch. Many kids will never have an opportunity to go up on top of those mountains in any way. We raise money and they can all go for a week, 4th, 5th, and 6th graders. And we've been doing it now for 15 years. And it has changed lives. And I find it hard to articulate sometimes how powerful skiing is as a vessel for change for any child, because so many people who aren't skiers just think it's a frivolous pursuit. You know, it's just fun, whatever. It's almost too easy, frankly. Like, when you get somebody outside up in the mountains, it can really look at yourself. You're a scientist as a result of skiing. And the more people we can turn on to that, it's just so powerful. So it's exciting. And I hope you can keep motivated, because it is super important.
Totally. Yeah. And I totally agree with that sentiment of like, there are a lot of people who think skiing is just this thing you go out and you do for fun, and only people with a lot of money or privilege should have access to that, or do have access to that. And I think like that's part of the reason I wanted to make this film we're making, is because that's the narrative we are telling people. I mean, so many people who are skiers believe that narrative, but people who don't have any access to skiing or snowboarding or really know what that means also think that that's what skiing is. And you and I both know that's not what skiing is. Like, skiing is this changing force. Skiing is this place of connection. Skiing can be whatever you want skiing to be. And it doesn't have to be this extractive thing, which I think is like part of like the theme and the message of the film is like the outdoor industry and skiing can be an extractive industry. And we have seen that, especially in Alaska, especially with heli skiing, especially with outdoor media depicting Alaska as this untouched place for people to conquer, which has made it this pinnacle of you're the best outdoor recreationalist if you are either going to Alaska to ski or to do first descents or first ascents or whatever. All of those notions and narratives that we put around skiing is how it is an extractive industry. But the act of skiing itself doesn't have to be that. It doesn't have to be extractive. It can be this point of joy, it can be this point of change. And that's part of the message that I want to share with everyone, whether you are native or non-native, because I think a lot of non-native people miss that and don't see that like, yes, skiing can be your whole personality. You can be a ski bum. And that can be not about just being this difference maker in society or trying to do something. It could just be like, that's a really cool and important thing you're doing for yourself and your body, your own mental health. And at the same time, I want to change that perception in native communities because I think a lot of native communities hear those narratives and think, oh, skiing's a white thing. Skiing is this extractive thing. Skiing is this colonial thing to do. And we all are forgetting the fact that skiing comes from Indigenous people and skiing should be Indigenous. And whether you are Indigenous or not, you could ski more responsibly and you could ski for yourself. You could ski for others. You could ski for the land. And that can all be awesome.
Amen. So Ellen, before I let you go, I want to ask, what can outdoor media do that it's not doing when it comes to recognizing Indigenous people and their lands and also their stories and a story like your own?
I would say, let us tell our own stories and support us in doing that, which means funding Native stories, which is especially prevalent for me in my story. We had funding from a brand to start our film, and then they pulled all of our funding a week into filming, so we've been self-funding our film since the beginning. And I think that's a really common story across like filmmaking in general, but especially for Indigenous filmmakers of like a brand or a company or a person or something can be really excited about your story one day and then just not care and just take all of your funding away. Or you can never find funding. I think another thing I'd add on that is I just watched, I don't remember exactly what it's called, as like Culture is Indigenous Women or something. It was an NBC broadcast that a woman from my tribe hosted. And they had Amber Midthunder was one of the people who's on it, who's the actress who plays the main character in Prey, one of the Predator movies that was all in Comanche. And she said, I'm misquoting for sure what she said exactly, but essentially what she said is like, Indigenous people are the original storytellers. Everyone else has been playing within our medium without us until this point. And now that we are having more opportunities to tell our own stories, I think we all need to be reminded of that and reminded that like essentially like the stories we are telling, we're good at telling. We come from storytelling communities. We come from oral traditions. We come from a people who have told stories for tens of thousands of years that we still have to this day. And that's a bit different than when we think of storytelling with an outdoor media, right? Like a journalist telling a story about someone going on an expedition is a very different kind of storytelling than the storytelling that Indigenous people are very accustomed to doing. And so I think like it is past time that we are allowed to tell our own stories. And a filmmaker reached out to me recently asking me essentially, I think, to consult on a film that he had already written and was already crowdfunding for. And it was a fiction film that he had written a story about Valdez, Alaska, and wanted to have native characters in it. And it was like they were going to use skiing as like an alternative to oil extraction. And I was really confused on when this guy reached out to me because I had never talked to him before. In the email, he didn't introduce himself or tell me why he was reaching out to me. He just kind of sent me this Kickstarter to fund his film and then was just like, I would like to talk to you about this film, and just gave me like a 1-sentence concept. And so I reached out, asked some questions, follow up like, oh, like, who have you been connected with in Valdez about this story? What Native people's communities have you been talking to about this story? And he came back and he said that he hadn't talked to anyone, that this was his story that he wrote based on his own experiences as a white man who visited Valdez one time. That he wasn't from Valdez, he's from, I think, LA. And he wanted to write this story. And so I just was like, okay, well, I'm very uncomfortable moving forward with you on this then. If you are writing Native characters on a story and you don't have any Native people working on this, I'm not going to be that Native person who comes in to work on this now. I'm not from Valdez. My people are not from Valdez. And it was just a really uncomfortable situation. And it's not the first time that I've gotten emails like that. I get a lot of emails like that. And I know a lot of other Indigenous storytellers and filmmakers in this space who get a lot of emails like that, of people reaching out to them, either wanting us to connect them to other people and like play a producer role, uncompensated, just for fun, just because we're Native storytellers in these spaces. Or they're just like asking us to consult on their story. And it's frustrating because I know all the people that I have recently talked to about this have our own stories to tell that nobody in the outdoor media space is wanting us to tell. Nobody wants to fund it. Nobody wants to support us. I think at the end of the day, like, it's just past time that we tell our own stories. And I think there are a lot of ways that non-Indigenous people can support us in that. I think like, especially navigating funding spaces is like a really awesome way that non-Indigenous people who have a better understanding of how those funding spaces might work can be really helpful. I think like navigating film festivals is another way that non-Indigenous people can be really helpful. Is navigating like, when do those applications open for different film festivals? What are the right film festivals to put specific films in? I think there's a ton of other ways non-Indigenous peoples can be supportive and helping to tell Indigenous or even just non-white stories. But I think at the end of the day, it's like, let us tell our own stories. And if that means we're telling these stories in collaboration, if we're co-directing, co-writing, co-producing, whatever it is, at the end of the day, you let us take over on our own expertise of our own stories and allow us to set some really strong boundaries when it comes to that, about who we will work with and what conditions need to exist in order for us to feel comfortable working with those people. And I'll say also, like, especially in the film world, like, I'm super new to the film world. This is the first film I've ever worked on. And so I am no expert on what it means to be in the film world or what it means to be an Indigenous person in the film world. And I think there are a lot of other people who've had a lot more experience than me that are having these conversations, that are hoping to have these conversations in a bigger space at conferences, at festivals, with grantors. Essentially, the hope I've heard from a lot of people is to establish this protocol of like, what conditions actually do need to exist in order for there to be this really comfortable collaboration between Indigenous filmmakers and non-Indigenous filmmakers, so that everyone at the end of the day has their needs and wants supported. I would say stay tuned, because I think like the answers will be coming. And I think they're going to come from a lot more intelligent people in these spaces than me.
Well, I'm glad I asked the question. I had no idea what I was going to get. Coming from a non-film, like we have to work with video here and there, and it's confounding to me. I'm a word person and a picture person, but video is where it's at. Film is where it's at, and it's a complicated world.
Yeah, or at least Instagram really seems to think that video is where it's at.
Well, a lot of marketers too.
Yeah, which is fair, because I think video can be a lot more easy for a wider group of people to connect to than just words. It's not everyone is a word person. I feel that. And I feel that from other mediums other than film as well. Like the Cleanest Line story that we wrote was kind of a roller coaster of an experience working with Patagonia and working with their editors and their editing team. We had to have follow-up meetings with them to identify places in their processes where they were not set up to tell Indigenous stories whatsoever. We had fact-checkers fact-checking me on things I know about my own people, about my own stories, that were really harmful to see those in review, to see those edits being made. I think the sentiment of like, let Indigenous people tell their own stories, or let us set really strong boundaries about like who we will work with, or like what conditions need to exist. And one of those boundaries, at least for me, is like, I always want to review whatever is going to come out about me, no matter if I'm in it for 10 seconds or the whole hour. Like, I want to make sure that the way that I'm presented, my image, my likeness, feels appropriate to me, because at the end of the day, whenever I'm speaking, I am speaking for myself, but I'm also speaking for an entire community. And I have the responsibility of that entire community at the end of the day. So if I say something, or if I misrepresent myself, or if someone else misrepresents me or misquotes me, like, I'm the one who has to face that within my own community. And I think that can be really different than like for non-Indigenous people. Like, there isn't necessarily that accountability within a community in the same way. And so it's a different weight that we carry when we are telling stories than I think other people when they're just like telling their own story. They own their own story, they own their own narrative. And that's still true, but like there's other people we are responsible to. And I think that's an important acknowledgement to make when telling these stories.
And you're also responsible to that tradition, right? And that's part of it, yeah? And I think that's something that those of us who don't have that diaspora to be regarding all the time, we cannot even have sight of it, right?
Yeah. And I was going to say, especially when you're like the person that's breaking through into these spaces where we haven't been able to exist, then you're especially responsible to that, because like mine and the other Indigenous skiers that are breaking into these outdoor industry spaces, it's our responsibility to make it really clear where we stand on things so that the next generation, the next group of Indigenous people who comes into these spaces don't also then have to start from scratch. They already at least have some level of a baseline that we have helped to set up for them so that they can keep pushing the envelope in ways that we couldn't when we're having to do native perspective on the outdoor industry 101, I don't want to be one of the only Indigenous people in these spaces forever. I want other people to take my space. People who have grown up in Juneau, who've grown up skiing the Eagle Crest their whole life, who've had an entire life's experience of skiing on their own traditional homelands, to come into the outdoor industry and be like, this is what I think. This is what I think the direction of this industry should be going. This is where I think my tribe should or should not be involved in like regulating what is going on in these places. And you all should be listening to me because you are skiing on my land that my people have been on forever. And I think like the day that that's where the outdoor industry is, where the decision makers about where we're going, what kind of media we're telling, what kind of stories exist in these spaces, like that's the day that I'm going to be so stoked. Like I'm already stoked about skiing, but that's just going to be the day that I'm stoked on the industry of being like, we're finally changing things, is when our own people are telling our own stories and the outdoor industry is listening. Because right now, I think a lot of people want to uplift us to try to tell these stories because they think it's important or they've been told it's important by society. But I think it hasn't quite changed the industry yet. I'm really looking forward to the day that the industry actually starts to change because of some of the things that we're able to start having these conversations.
Well, Ellen, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining me today. It was illuminating, and I'm excited to get it out there. Thank you for listening and subscribing to the Backcountry Podcast and for supporting independent media. The Backcountry Podcast is produced by Backcountry Magazine, an imprint of Height of Land Publications in Jeffersonville, Vermont. Backcountry's small but mighty staff works hard to bring you stories that are beautifully produced, thoughtfully edited, and thoroughly fact-checked. Betsy Monero is our editor-in-chief. Mike Horn is our podcast producer and engineer. Our music was composed by Alex Paul. Please consider supporting independent journalism by subscribing at backcountrymagazine.com. Use code PODCAST for 10% off your entire order. I'm Adam Howard. Thanks for listening. Until next time, we'll see you in the backcountry.